Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Modern Lab Leader 2023. My name is Princess Senate, and I am here to moderate today's event alongside my colleagues Gemma Seabrook and George Hammond. Before we start the talks today, I just have some general information and a few tips for getting the most out of the event. Firstly, as well as the fantastic lineup of speakers we have for you, I'd like to point out the networking areas on the platform which you can use to chat with other delegates throughout the day. On the left hand side, you will see the People tab where you can access a list of attendees that you can contact. From here, you can message them privately, and all your ongoing conversations will appear in the chats area. I encourage you to get involved and take this opportunity to speak to some of the over the 750 delegates that have registered for the event. If you are not sure who you would like to chat to, we encourage you to use our participant matching feature to match with attendees who share similar interests to you. Just navigate to participant matching located in the left hand menu and fill out a brief questionnaire. Our software will then do all the hard work for you and match you with other attendees with similar interests and goals. In the list of matches, there will also be a percentage match, which indicates how close of a match your responses were to the attendee in the list. Please remember that we encourage debate and discussion and welcome all of you to use our networking services to introduce yourself to other attendees, but we do not permit the overt solicitation of products or services and reserve the right to block any user who infringes on this rule. On a similar note, all of today's talk offer the ability for you to engage with our speakers via the Q&A session at the end of each talk. I encourage all of you to ask questions, as this is the best opportunity to get live answers from our panel of experts. We will explain how you can ask questions at the start of each presentation. It's also incredibly important to say that this event was only made possible thanks to the generosity of our sponsors and partners, particularly our platinum sponsor Agilent Cross Lab Group. In the Literature and Resources section, you can download free educational pieces from our sponsors and partners, including application notes, white papers, and guides focused on an effective asset management program, selecting and investing on the correct instrumentation and laboratory software for your lab. For more detailed instructions on how to make the most of the features available to you at this event, please navigate to the event home and watch the overview video at the top of the page. We would like to ask if you could please refrain from video, audio, or photo recording of all talks. Many of our speakers have kindly agreed to share their slides with you, and these are available within the literature section on the platform. Some of our speakers will have included their contact details in their presentations. If they do, please feel free to reach out to them directly. If you'd like to contact the online symposium team at any point, please contact us via the technical help tab at the bottom of the navigation bar on the left. With that out of the way, I will now hand over to George to introduce our opening and keynote session for the event.
Thank you, Princess. With that, I will now move on to introduce our first talk of the day, Crafting a Research Ecosystem for Excellence and Impact. I'm George Hammond, conference producer at Technology Networks, and I'm pleased to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Christopher Cramer. Dr. Cramer is the Senior Vice President and Chief Research Officer for the nonprofit UL Research Institutes. Dr. Cramer oversees a broad portfolio of projects, all sharing a focus on fundamental and applied safety science research. Prior to this role, Dr. Cramer's professional career began with 4 years of service as an officer in the United States Army, after which he pursued an academic career as a theoretical chemist at the University of Minnesota, where his research group focused on many topics including catalysis, eco-remediation chemistry, and the synthesis of sustainable polymers. Dr. Cramer culminated his service to Minnesota as the institution's vice president for research, and he continues to hold the title of Distinguished McKnight and University Teaching Professor Emeritus. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Cramer. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. You can also use this feature to connect with attendees and discuss the talk, so feel free to take advantage of the chat system by introducing yourself and sharing your thoughts during this presentation. You can also benefit from some fantastic supporting literature, which you can download for free below the video player. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please request help using the technical help icon in the menu on the left-hand side of the player. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Cramer to begin his presentation.
Well, thank you so much, George, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm sorry that I can't be appearing live. I actually have a commitment for a quarterly Board of Trustees meeting, which will take me away, but I hope to be able to share some thoughts and observations that will be valuable to all who are watching. So, indeed, we've already had a little bit of bio, so I will not dwell on my background other than noting that I moved from academia to a not-for-profit organization, both sharing a commitment to the public good and sort of nonprofit status. And I'll be offering some observations from that standpoint. But first, I feel obliged to tell you a bit about my organization so that you have some context from which to understand the remainder of the talk. And I have to tell you about the UL enterprise, if you will. So I'm with UL Research Institutes, and there are three things that are associated with UL now, three brands, if you will. It's actually quite an old organization, founded in 1894, and so all three of the organizations shown at the right have evolved from that original founding. Founded as a 501c3, that's a United States tax code for a nonprofit public charity with a research and education focused mission. And really the objective since the founding was to improve safety in a broad context by doing research, by creating standards, by doing testing, inspection, certification to make products, technologies, what have you, safer. It also nowadays, of course, is very important for international trade to have standards, but originally focused on what I'll call this safety science. Over the course of 130 years, this became quite an industry in some sense, especially in the 20th century. And there are now many for-profit organizations that are engaged in testing, inspection, and certification. And in order to remain competitive, in 2012, if you see UL Solutions here as the lowest organization, the Board of Trustees of Underwriters Laboratories, Inc., created UL Solutions, now branded as UL Solutions, a for-profit entity, which in fact was about 99% of the organization. So that's a 15,000 plus employee organization, continues to operate today, very successful testing, inspection, certification, business services, for-profit entity. It is wholly owned as a subsidiary of another organization called UL Standards and Engagement. That is a 501c4. I won't take you through the intricacies of US tax code, but suffice it to say that is a nonprofit that can engage in lobbying, if you will, so helping policymakers set policy. And my organization, UL Research Institutes, the inheritor of the legacy of that 130 years of history, is a beneficiary of UL Standards and Engagement, which owns that for-profit. So it's a bit complex, but the reason I tell you is the Board of Trustees, when it created this tripartite organization, if you will, in 2021, tripartite enterprise, recommitted in some sense to the original public good mission by taking $1.8 billion of assets that had been building up over the years and committing it to the two nonprofit organizations to address increasingly complex public safety risks, strengthen the impact of our safety science mission. And that's where I came in. In 2021, I joined UL Research Institutes as the Chief Research Officer and was asked to assist the Board of Trustees in realizing that vision of building out a research organization. And so that was really the charge, if you will, build, grow our research organization. That's people, facilities, equipment, partnerships with stakeholders, as well as the topical portfolio. So I'll tell you a bit more about the nature of our research in a few moments. But there was a set of legacy focus areas, if you will, although at relatively small scale, and obviously with this new injection of resources and opportunity to think broadly about new areas we'd like to move into with our research focus. And again, just to set the context for what I'll tell you about in 2021, at the time of my arrival, what was in place, if you will, the legacy, was an organization having expenditures of about $20 million per year. There were about 35 full-time equivalent staff. And to the extent that it was organized into subunits, we have a Fire Safety Research Institute in 2021, Chemical Insights Research Institute. Think of that as sort of a human exposure laboratory, toxicology, air quality focus. A group working on battery safety that did not have a formal name yet associated with it as a research institute, if you will. And then some educators that were salted through a more heterogeneous communications function. And then finally, the Office of the Chief Research Officer, that was me. I was the Office of the Chief Research Officer in 2021. And that was the baseline. So how does one get started on a fairly large process of taking a great deal of money? $1.8 billion is 10 figures after all, at least in American billions it is, 10 figures. And I guess at this stage, I'm going to go into my sort of thoughts on on how to do these things, which is both sort of a management perspective as well as maybe a research perspective. I certainly was an active researcher for most of my career. But you really need to start, obviously, on an endeavor of this scale with fundamentals. So organizational fundamentals. What is the mission? What are your values? What are going to be your strategic priorities? Because whenever you're expanding really rapidly, growing really rapidly, you need certain things that bind the whole organization, that'll allow you to all move in the same direction at the same time and achieve some sort of shared progress. And of course, critical to making that progress is not only getting to the stage of a shared vision, but keeping it. And the only way to do that is to communicate with fervor. And so at the outset, obviously, I was a newcomer to the organization. It's pretty important to begin by understanding what you're arriving to. So there's a listen, listen, listen phase. And then finally, there's a speak, 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 and then continue speaking phase. It's become trite, I suppose, and a truism to say that, oh, internal communication is so important. But it's trite and a truism because it's really accurate and true. It's only through repeating over and over again the mission, the values, the strategic priorities to the point where everyone feels they could say them in their sleep, that's actually a good thing. It allows you to make progress with shared understanding. And so let me say where we landed. I don't want to say too much about process. Well, I will say some about process, but I'll also say something about outcomes. So as a research organization, I think we determined integrity was one of the key values. Once you lose any trust in your research, you've lost everything. So that's quite critical. We are a not-for-profit dedicated to the public good. So beneficence was a key value for us. And then somewhat different, I would say, from academia and the ivory tower, if you will, is the degree to which we valued engagement. So in order to have an impact, we have to reach stakeholders in a really significant way, ensure we understand their needs. That's true, obviously, for-profit businesses as well. And so that was a third value we settled on. And then with respect to strategic priorities, we're interested in safety. There are safety risks associated with existing technologies. So I would call that address the pressing needs of today. There are emerging technologies which have unknown safety risks, or at least they're only coming into focus. That's identifying the emerging threats of tomorrow. And then finally, as I said, in order to have an impact, you can't just necessarily generate knowledge. It's important that you translate that knowledge or transfer it, as the case may be, to actual interventions, mitigation strategies. So we call that accelerate the transfer of knowledge for the public good. And then another interesting dilemma to some extent, although it was a delightful dilemma to face, was our board of trustees was interested in putting a lot of resources into new areas. But as you see on the right there, that graphic is designed to say it's a bit like being in a candy store. There are so many potential areas upon which one could focus all of which would meet safety science criteria, if you will. They have certain risks associated with them. There are research needs in order to tackle them. Well, how do you settle on what you want to do and have a cohesive message? And at the same time, incidentally, while in the candy store, there can be a tendency of saying, it's a bold new day. We have new things in front of us. And you forget that your legacy areas may in fact be quite strong and valuable as well. And you don't want to discount those existing strengths and fail to invest appropriately in them and take them potentially to a next level. So that was, again, sort of mission one. Think about where do we want to start moving forward. And for us to do that, we finally decided there were 3 questions we needed to ask about any potential new area. So is the safety risk that we want to address significant in scope, either now or as an emerging threat? And there are many ways to sort of assess that and consult with others to get a feeling for the level of the threat. Is there white space in the research community? Because with these new resources, we don't necessarily want to become a new player that will just make incremental advances in a very mature area. And so, for instance, one might say in the health area, cancer obviously is a health scourge that has been with us for centuries, and there are many, many biomedically focused organizations looking at that. Would we be able to somehow move the needle by getting into it? Probably not. But there are distinct areas where maybe we can, in fact, have almost a first mover advantage, if you will. And then last of all, do we have the capacity? $1.8 billion is a lot of money, but it's not an infinite amount of money. So can we assemble the resources needed, not just financial, but facilities, people, what's the hiring market look like in that space in order to make meaningful and timely progress? And having done that, we decided we would focus our research around what we call grand challenge commitments. So our 3 grand challenge commitments we did settle on are resilience for a sustainable future, individual and societal health in the 21st century. And I'll note that in the 21st century is designed to invoke for people that we're looking at health impacts that really have derived from us being in an industrial age. Since the Industrial Revolution, what have been the health consequences associated with our technological society? So that's not necessarily traditional biomedical threats, but instead, because we've modified the environment, perhaps in some way, what have we increased the risk of with certain populations? And then finally, safety at the human-digital interface. And I'm really here to talk more about process than about the specifics of these, but I think anyone looking at these will recognize that, yes, there are significant safety issues associated with these various grand challenge commitments, and there's a lot of room to make progress against them. So putting all that together and chunking it all down onto one slide, if you will, which can be very useful when sharing with people, we've developed a mission: make the world safer through research and engagement. A vision that we want to be the leading safety science research organization. We've picked our grand challenge commitments, and we know that the enablers needed to get these things done are growing our people, growing our capacity, growing our scope. So since 21, we've been in a ferocious growth stage. So we're a 130-year-old startup company. It's a little bit of a paradox, but it's also been a lot of fun. And it's important to have a theory of impact. What is it that you want to do? For-profit businesses, of course, they want to maximize return to shareholders. That's a fairly straightforward theory of impact. For a research organization, it can be a bit trickier to define, but we spent some time thinking about that. And so our enablers down at the bottom here, the growing people, capacity, and scope, we're doing it because we will then have capacity to do meaningful research. We will constantly be working with stakeholders to understand what are the most salient topics that will guide our research, advance our safety science across the grand challenge commitments, which we've adopted as boundaries, if you will, within which we intend to work. But then finally, we want that research to lead to deeper understanding, discovery, adoption of our safety measures, fostering a safer world. And it's probably best to give you a clear example of what that really means for us. So I'll tell you something about our legacy Fire Safety Research Institute, which continues to do great work and had been around at the time of my arrival. And the stakeholders of our Fire Safety Research Institute include, for example, the fire service, firefighters, if you will. And the research begins with, sort of discrete, tangible research endeavors like understanding how does horizontal ventilation affect a fire in a built structure? How does vertical ventilation? What about positive pressure? What about the different fire attack strategies that firefighters might use as they approach a certain structure that's exhibiting certain kinds of flame, smoke, what have you? Out of those individual research projects, deliverables begin to be generated, which can include technical reports, journal articles, but importantly for us, also training, because we want to get our science to the streets as a way to think about this. A public service campaign we called Close Before You Doze, which illustrates the degree to which a closed bedroom door can protect inhabitants from fire outside in an amazing way. This increases engagement. That's our goal. So of the training courses, for instance, we had 135,000 completions at the time we put this together fairly recently. Props that firefighters can use to practice some of their attack strategies that are downloadable, and go to your local lumber store and you can build them yourself. Dramatic video views that are part of the public service campaign, actually awards from the public relations industry. I won't dwell on some of the accolades that came for that public service award, but the bottom line, what's the real world impact that we're trying to track? how many line of duty deaths did we reduce potentially? That's a hard number, obviously, to be confident about, but nevertheless, it's something we can observe over time. Line of duty deaths, civilian deaths, if you will, lives saved from close before you doze. That's what I would call real world impact, lives saved. It's hard to argue that that's pretty important. All right, so this has all been sort of a lead up to how did we decide what we wanted to do and what our strategy was going to be to go forward. But now let's come back to the fact that being offered $1.8 billion, I keep coming back to, that's potential, right? It is not yet authority. So the Board of Trustees, I mentioned I can't do this live because I'll be at our third quarter Board of Trustees meeting, obviously wants to be convinced that we're going to be good stewards of those resources. And how do you go about transforming potential to authority? And I think there's two really important things here, and this translates very generally in both the not-for-profit and for-profit worlds. You need a real consistency of message. So boards meet periodically, tend to be composed of busy people. It's really great to be able to communicate in a way that is consistent, reminds people of progress that's been made. So I come back again and again, the mission, values, strategy, impact framework to explain why the priorities we're asking for investment in are consistent with that overall framework. And it's actually also quite useful. Typically the larger group that needs to be convinced, which by the way, isn't just the board, it's also other senior managers typically, because you want to be presenting a consistent message amongst yourselves. Getting early buy-in from the key influencers. So I suppose, again, this is more a management piece of observation or advice, can be very useful as opposed to just attempting to present something bold and new to a larger group that has not necessarily had any foreshadowing. And so in my case, there are certain people who understand the research side more deeply, say, than others who may understand financial side or other management sides. And I try to be very deliberate about speaking with them well ahead of time in order to turn them into advocates who can support any messaging I may be presenting. So in-depth briefing opportunities well ahead of decision-making meetings. And so now really let me turn to, okay, you've successfully convinced folks, you've got an approved budget, you're ready to go, you've described what you want to do. How do you execute on it? And I have emphasized that in the case of UL Research Institutes, there were sort of two avenues for us. There was building up great legacy areas, but there was also the opportunity to do brand new things. So let's talk about starting something brand new. So you've done the hard work of deciding out of that candy store, based on mission, values, strategies, what you want to do. You need to hire leadership to do it. I am a chemist by training, and I understand chemistry pretty well, but I mentioned we wanted to do things in the digital safety space, for instance. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, I am by no means an expert in that. So really critical, obviously, to hire subordinate leaders who are going to be able to build something new themselves and come with a vision and an ability to execute that vision. And so I think what I'd say with respect to that leadership challenge, because you really need to hire the leaders before you can hire the rest of the organization that will report to them, because they need to help shape that. It's really important to be patient. So when you're sitting on a new investment and have new authority, there's a tendency to want to move forward very quickly. You're enthusiastic, but waiting until you get that right person that will ensure that afterwards you're on the right slope and will achieve the bold vision is quite important. And speaking of bold, particularly for laboratory-based operations, the infrastructure that you intend to use to build out your new capability is really critical. And so when I say be bold, I think what I would say, if it's a greenfield operation, you have the amazing opportunity to pursue a state-of-the-art approach, right? You're not necessarily trying to renovate or retrofit, but instead starting from scratch. So even though, new state-of-the-art technology, first adopter technology can be a little bit of an expensive investment, in my opinion and in my experience, it pays off to make that investment. So I'm showing a robot here, for instance. Robotics is obviously transforming a lot of industries in terms of the ability to one I know well is material science, high throughput synthesis, high throughput characterization. We are in fact building a materials discovery research institute. And so I'm very cognizant of what's going on in that space. And it's been an expensive investment, but I'm quite confident we're going to see a return on that investment that's extraordinary. So be bold is my message there. Now, coming back to the building a legacy. So on my arrival, looking at our Chemical Insights Research Institute, our Fire Safety Research Institute, I was convinced and impressed by what they had done, even though it had been at a sort of lower scale and lower volume of work because of the resources available at the time. So what's important here is to ensure that they evolve in conformity, I guess I will say, with the bigger vision that has been built. So ensuring that it's not sort of a siloization, I think I'm making that word up, but to the extent that they recognize they're part of the larger organization, they benefit from being that part of that larger growing organization, and the organization benefits from their institutional experience and from the foundation they bring. So conformity, I think, is just a question of that communications, the message. As we grow, as we evolve, is it consistent with the mission, values, strategy, et cetera? Of course, growth continues to imply new people and new infrastructure, and one should be absolutely as bold in this instance. So I'm showing sort of a dramatic fire experiment there, and we are very committed in our growth plans to having state-of-the-art fire research facilities, which are somewhat unique in the world. There are not very many organizations that study this, and we want to be at the forefront. Of course, it would be really nice if one just jumped in and everything worked to plan, and you had the capacity to hire 100 people in a year when you're only at 35. You can put into place your own financial organization, human resources organization. But it takes some time to get there. There is a road that must be followed. And so it's very important to be aware that you have to have sort of interim solutions along the way in addition to the grand vision. So the interim solutions help you to build momentum. I talked about how we need to invest in new facilities, for instance. However, that doesn't mean that you have the luxury of just doing nothing until that new facility is ready. And so we've tried to be nimble about identifying temporary space. We have very important work going on in what's called our Electrochemical Safety Research Institute, looks at batteries, amongst other things. And so finding ways to put that institute into temporary space as we look for a more permanent solution for them has helped to continue to drive the research, realize the vision, help to put flags in the ground, if you will, on some of those research topics. In addition, of course, there is a broad array of organizations, consulting organizations, staffing organizations, you name it, that are out there to support organizations that need some sort of temporary service or bridging service, what have you. And my advice there is to employ judiciously. And by judiciously, I think what I mean is, at least in my experience, consulting organizations that bring either advice or capabilities. Perhaps they're coming in and they're helping with financial management for a certain period of time as you build up a financial management function. They can be terrifically useful, but they also come with maybe danger is too strong a word, but they come with experience, let's put it that way. And the experience they have with other organizations, there's a tendency to believe that that may be exactly right for your organization as they come in. And it's important to recognize when you're inside your own organization, that may not be true. Take advice with grains of salt, assess what is likely to work or not work because of the distinct character of your own organization relative to the ones that those you've contracted with may have seen in the past. And I say that in particular because UL Research Institute is kind of a strange organization in some ways. We look a bit like a higher education research institution, but we're not. We look a bit like a nonprofit that functions primarily through philanthropic awards, but we're not. And we look a bit like a national laboratory, but we're not exactly that either. And so we continue to sort of craft exactly who we are, and we're doing that with many consultants who've been incredibly useful to us. But in the long run, of course, we hope to be completely self-standing as we achieve some steady state in the future. So all of this I've referred to our investment of time and effort and financial resources has gone on for 2 years now, and I'll show you some statistics in a moment, maybe, about what we've achieved with that. But suffice it to say, the amount of change that we have been going through is simply enormous. So we currently have a change management list of major initiatives, if you will. Last time I looked, I think there's 17 major initiatives ongoing with, Gantt charts showing at what stage will we be hitting what milestones. That's a lot of change for an organization. And so change management just becomes an absolutely critical exercise, I guess I'll call it, that can't be ignored. You need to pay a lot of attention to it, and you need to have strategies in place so that your organization adapts effectively and grows. And so I have her start early and revisit often. So think very early on, what are going to be the impacts on your staff, and what's going to worry them, what's going to excite them, what can you do to mitigate the worries, what will be the strains on your various back office operations, and how do you make sure that they're staffed effectively? What about all your stakeholders who knew you as one thing and now you're becoming something very different? How do you keep the trust and also build new relationships? A lot of challenges associated with this kind of growth. So in terms of that change management, I think, again, I'll sort of offer my advice and experience and say, I'm a big fan of service leadership. So in order to calm the worries of the organization as it grows to some extent, convince people that you in a executive position or a management position of whatever sort are representing. You are a leader, but you understand what the concerns are, what the opportunities are, and you can only do that by doing a lot of consulting and then serving as a champion for what has become hopefully a consensus-driven approach to what the future looks like. So share your enthusiasm to help build that consensus, but then be the person who seems to be carrying the flag for more than just yourself or a small group that might be at the top. In terms of bandwidth, micromanagement is definitely your enemy in a rapid growth situation. There's just too many work streams to keep on top of. So you really do need to trust subordinate leaders and trust people all the way down the chain because there's just too much work to not be spreading it out over a very large number of people. And that's why the communication function continues to be super present. So the little blue communicator there, communicating up, down, sideways, ensuring the consistency of message, ensuring the handshake across levels with respect to knowing what's going on. And then finally, the last one there, bearing in mind that there will be technicalities you may not appreciate, and you should attempt to avoid risks, risk management, I guess, associated with that. And what I mean is, let's say we're building facilities. Boy, there are a lot of really technical issues associated with building out a new laboratory, which I think many of the people who are listening to this are well aware of. What are your power requirements? What are your HVAC requirements? Is there special instrumentation? Are there vibration consequences you need to worry about because you're putting in a scanning electron microscope? And you really need super technically qualified folks to give you all that advice before you move forward with a architectural plan, a general contracting, building out a facility, for example. So really being mindful of that ahead of time, even though you're in a hurry and you want to make a lot of progress, ensure that all those I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and get the appropriate help for that. In terms of approaching cruising altitude, so for me, this is still looking forward a bit. We've been at this 2 years, and we certainly are nowhere near what I might call an asymptote of steady state research, but at least we think we might see where that is in the future of 2025, 26, 27, if you will. Really important to celebrate wins along the way, right? Enthusiasm is a great thing to have, but you keep fostering that enthusiasm by recognizing accomplishments, by celebrating either, in our case, for instance, the founding of a new research institute or a particularly impactful research study that has just come out of a legacy research institute. You do need to be prepared to pivot. I think it's von Clausewitz, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Not that we have enemies at UL Research Institutes, but you will have things happen you did not expect, and it's important to be ready to be nimble. And also really critically, building policies and procedures. So as an organization, as we've built out, we really needed to create the underlying policy framework, the procedures that put policy into practice as we've built back office functions. And to make it clear, incidentally, you may be wondering, you were around 130 years, why didn't you have back office functions? So the research organization had largely been using the functions that were in our for-profit UL Solutions I mentioned. And remember, that's a for-profit business. It has back office functions very appropriate for such a business, but not necessarily that useful for a research organization. Some things might be common, but other things are quite different. And so we're separating and creating all our own so that we will ultimately be a standalone organization. So having a good policy framework in place is critically important. So where are we now? Let me tell you what's happened within the last 2 years. I am keeping in the sort of blue color the original things that were there in 2021, Chemical Insights Research Institute, Fire Safety Research Institute, and me, the Office of the Chief Research Officer. Since then, we have built 3 new institutes. We took our battery folks, we defined a scope that made them a research institute. That's the Electrochemical Safety, and I alluded to it. I also alluded to our Digital Safety Research Institute and Materials Discovery Research Institutes. Those last 2 only a year or less old now, so a very exciting phase as they begin building up. We also took our educators, put them together, helped to really refine their mission and called them the Office of Research Experiences and Education, built an Office of Partnerships, which is both a grant-making function, if you will, to some external collaborators, amongst other things, as well as to ensure managed relationships with stakeholders, and a research library. How can you be a research organization without a research library? So library and researcher information services. I told you earlier we started at about 35 FTEs. We're now at roughly 130 FTEs. So we've effectively quadrupled in size in 2 years. Our expenditures are now up to 100 million per year and are on just the research function and are continuing to grow. We're not yet scratching the surface of what that asymptote looks like. Just to give a slight feel for the overall research that these institutes do, the name obviously gives you some insight, but Chemical Insights promote human health through research and awareness of potential risk of chemical pollutants. I mentioned that's been primarily air quality in the past, but there's a lot of other ways to look at exposure risk. Digital Safety is developing open source tools because we're all about being able to take our research to users, in this case might be consumers, protect individuals and societies from evolving digital threats. Electrochemical safety, I mentioned a past history of batteries, but electrochemical technologies in general, as well as some other renewable energy solutions, hydrogen gas, for example. Fire Safety Research Institute, I already told you quite a bit about, but it's not just the fire service, it's also fires at the wildland-urban interface, where wildfire has obviously become an emerging climate change-driven risk that is worldwide, and we need to better understand how to address that. And our Materials Discovery Research Institute, which is looking at harnessing our power now to engineer things at atomic, nano, and meso scales and apply those to safety, sustainability, and health. And in my last slide, I think what I want to emphasize is I've had the privilege of giving you this talk and saying a bit about our evolution and hopefully some things that are transferable to others thinking of building out operations, whether at the single laboratory scale or a larger scale. But it's not just me. I am blessed with a team, a full organization really, but I'm just highlighting here our executive leadership team, which includes other people in the C-suite, as well as the fabulous leaders of my various research institutes and offices, many of whom are shown here as well. So it couldn't do it without them. I'm extremely grateful for their support. I'm excited to have had this opportunity to share. As I say, I hope I've added some value. And at this stage, I'd be only too happy to address any questions that might arise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cramer. That was an incredible presentation to kick off our Modern Lab Leader event. As with all the other talks, we're likely going to have lots of questions from the audience, and I can see that we have received some already. So I'll move straight onto the Q&A now. So your first question is, your organization is geographically dispersed within the United States. How does that affect overall management of your research and laboratory ecosystem?
Right. So, one of the concerns that can arise with a geographically distributed organization to some extent is that you'd be sort of duplicating resources in an inefficient way and for instance, instrumentation, laboratory instrumentation. You've got it in our case, our various institutes, just to name a few places. There's one in Maryland, there's one in Georgia, there's one in Texas, there's one in Illinois. Happily, that's a little less of an issue for us because the natures of their various research efforts are not necessarily so overlapping with respect to those kinds of requirements that there would be an efficiency gain by seeking, say, to combine them all in one place. That introduces upheaval when you do that from a personnel standpoint, if people have to move around the country. And that's not as much of a concern for us. A bigger concern maybe is just how do you ensure messaging, communication is effective when people are distributed and each organization is much smaller than each sub-organization smaller than the whole. And so that's back to, think about all the different ways you can communicate effectively and work with in my case, a vice president for communication and public relations to ensure your internal comms function is effective. And then also you need ways to kind of build cross-site esprit de corps, perhaps I'll call it. So I started a weekly seminar. We're a research organization, so we really ought to have research seminars, for instance, that had not been in place previously. And the goal is for all the different components of our research organization to hear about what each other are doing, potentially identify collaborative opportunities, because there are overlaps, even if they're not necessarily using exactly the same instruments. So I think, that's part of the trick, to find ways to bind. We're lucky, obviously, that we now have much better video technology and other kinds of web resources to assist in that than we used to. But paying attention to that is important, and occasionally having, in our case, we have an annual research symposium. It actually will kick off in 3 days. So if I look nervous, that's because we're hosting almost 300 people in 3 days to an annual research symposium. But that also brings all of us together in a single location, and that carries great value for the rest of the year.
Thank you for that excellent answer, Chris. I'm going to move on swiftly to your next question from the audience, which is, say a bit more about assessing impact and ensuring accountability within the special challenges of a research environment.
Yes, and I think the research issue is, you want to be a responsible steward, and it will be unsurprising that those to whom you answer, in my case, a board of trustees, would like some sort of, metrics, goals, key performance indicators, you name it, that show that you're getting a return on your investment. And because we're a nonprofit, our return is not profitability, it's impact. And, sometimes research takes a long time to have an impact, especially sort of basic research. And you don't have the luxury of saying, well, just give me 7 years and wait and see how much adoption we have of this. And so you kind of need to have a balance as you report out to those who are paying attention. And this includes other stakeholders, not necessarily just within your own organization, of sort of productivity. So productivity is not necessarily impact, right? For a research organization, you write papers, you write technical reports, whatever it is. But I guess I would submit, even if it's not sufficient, it's necessary, right? It is the first step to creating the corpus of knowledge, of work, of invention disclosures, intellectual property, you name it, that will ultimately transition to impact. So being, clear about the time required, but also that there are these steps along the way that you can be paying attention to. And then on the only other thing I'd mention perhaps is, typically when you're talking about research, you just can't discount the value of advice from peer researchers to some extent. I mean, by definition, research implies being at the forefront of a given area of knowledge. And it's other people at that forefront that you really need to solicit opinions from in order to get the feedback of, yes, there is consensus in this area that that's the right direction to be moving. And hopefully you are not, forced to operate in such secrecy. We are not. We're a public organization. Well, or at least we're open to the public, if you will, open science, open access, you name it. Of course, within a for-profit world, you may have concerns about what constitutes things that need to be kept more private. But still, you know, you put people under NDA and get their advice and use that to assess impact. So I think those are the two important things.
Thank you so much, Christopher. We have time for one final question today before we wrap up, and it will be, as administrative duties take up more and more of a leader's role, how important is it to continue to be engaged with scientific and technical details?
Yeah, I'd like to tell people who are traveling up an administrative path that you get to put that down a little bit as you take up other responsibilities, but I won't. I'll say actually that it's really critical. It's really critical because it ensures your credibility with the people you're leading. And moreover, I'll just express my own experience as I, you know, grew in authority over things that more than just chemistry. Hey, I had, you know, 40 years worth of chemistry to fall back on. I always felt pretty expert, but you know, as I said, I don't know much about digital science necessarily. So what's really critical actually is ask questions, lots and lots of questions, even though you might think it's kind of a stupid question or a really elementary question. And in my mind, that is a real challenge. There are a lot of people who don't want to look like they don't know whatever it is they don't know, and, you know, think they'll lose respect on that basis. My own experience, and I'll point to being vice president for research at the University of Minnesota for a moment, where, wow, the panoply of research was just extraordinarily broad, agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, every time I would ask a researcher a question about what they were doing, they would just light up. They couldn't wait to tell me. It didn't matter how elementary it was. I learned something. They felt good. It helped build that esprit I'm talking about. So I think that continuing to dive into your own organization, if it's a research organization, try to understand what's happening at the lowest levels, even though you'll never be as expert as the true practitioners. It's invigorating. It again builds that sense that there's shared values, shared mission, and you get to represent some of those great things to other people in management, to, in my case, a board of trustees. And those are the vignettes, the stories that sometimes carry far more impact than, you know, sort of routine tabulated metrics. People really love stories, and they're important to be aware of.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cramer. That is a really fantastic answer. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. Any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be sent to the speaker following on from the event. And as with all the other talks in the event, this talk will now be made available to view whenever you want for the next 30 days. And that just leaves me to say thank you once again, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you present with us. We really appreciate your expertise and your insights. And we will be back soon with the next talk.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.